Our next talk is going to be through Zoom, and our speaker is Saima Malik-Moraleda with co-authors Kyle Mahowald, Bevil, Conway, and Ted Gibson. And the title is Concepts Are Restructured During Language Contact, the Case of Color Words in Tsimane Spanish Bilinguals.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Saima. I'm here to present work done in Ted Gibson's lab here at MIT, along with Kyle and Bevil Conway, where we look at color words in Tsimane Spanish bilinguals. And, spoiler alert, concepts are restructured during language contact. That's the title of our talk. Firstly, before I move on, we just want to thank the AmLab organizers for allowing me to present virtually. I'm really sad not being able to be at York. I've yet to be able to participate in an in-person conference so far since the pandemic. And I really missed something that I picked up as I was waiting toward the start of this conversation, which is the chit chat between participants right before the talk. And I would guess that the same was happening there with people having conversations, and I bet sometimes they go more smoothly and sometimes they're a little more awkward. I could hear it happening. And I also bet that some of you are having these conversations in a language that is not your native language. And the reason I'm confident in this assertion is because the majority of the world population speaks two or more languages, with the number of bilinguals or multilinguals raising over the years. And so a question we may have is, how does learning a new language affect a native language? And there's been previous studies that show that there are effects on the form of a native language upon learning a second language, such as morpheme, phoneme, syntax are changed when you learn a new language. But what we're interested in is, what about the concepts? Do concepts change when you learn a new language? Concepts in your native language, do they change? There have been some attempts to answer this question within the Whorfian tradition. As you all might be aware, in the Whorfian tradition, language and thought and language recognition are tightly interlinked. And so, according to them, learning in a second language would affect, indeed, a native language. For instance, Boroditsky talks about how frames of reference for time, where English speakers represent past on the left and future on the right on a horizontal plane, while Mandarin speakers represent past at the bottom, future at the top in a vertical plane. And in Mandarin speakers, when they learn Mandarin, it seems like this horizontal plane gets shifted when they learn Mandarin. On the other hand, Athanasopoulos looks at Greek speakers who have two words for blue. So these are all blue chips, and some of these chips are light blue, and there's a word in Greek for that, and darker blue, which has another word for that, would refer to blue. And as we all know, in English, we only have one term, which is blue, so that would color all these. And when Greek native speakers learn English, and they're asked to do this division of chips in their native language, the amount of blue chips that they call now blue increases according to Athanasopoulos, due to the exposure to English blue. However, some of the studies on frame of references have not been replicated, with these replications not having been published by January and Kako. And the effects in Athanasopoulos look relatively small, constrained to a few chips. And we think that maybe the reason this may be is because participants tested above are industrialized and share similar cultures, and therefore these effects might be hard to measure. The differences between these communities might not be as large. In particular, for instance, in Athanasopoulos, they're using color words, and the difference between Greek and English color words is one extra term in Greek, while we know that the amount of color terms in languages can vary from 2 to 12, according to a World Color Survey done by Kay and colleagues over many years. And here's a representation of some of these World Color Survey terms done by Gibson and colleagues. What I'm showing here are, in each row, are languages and how they organize chips, such as the most consistent chips are on this left side, and the chips where there's not a consistent term are on the right side. And as you can see, there seems to be a universal pattern across all languages, with whites and reds and some blacks being spoken to more consistently than like cold colors such as blues. And there's also a ranking of how consistent a language is. So there are some languages that are at the very top and are highly consistent in speaking about color, and some languages that are not. And Gibson and colleagues relate this consistency to communicative efficiency. So industrialized cultures might talk about color more, and this will make sense in just a few seconds. So English and Spanish, for instance, are at the very top of the scale. They have color terms that are used and shared across speakers of these languages highly consistently. And then we'd have Tsimane down below, where they don't use color terms as consistently. And the Tsimane speakers, if you're wondering, they live in the Bolivian Amazon, and on the banks of the river, and in their environment, there's not a lot of things that differ just by color, right? So they don't need to talk about color as much. And a reaction I sometimes get is like, this is so weird, and pun intended, in terms of like, indeed, we are the weird ones, and the pun being that we are the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, et cetera, in our environments, in industrialized environments, we have a lot of things that are exactly the same, are replicas, but they just change by color. So we learn to talk about color, and we have now come to talk about color for a lot of things where we wouldn't probably need to talk about color, right? So for instance, we might say like the sky is blue, but the Tsimane would say the sky is cloudless, right? And or when we talk about like a banana, we might say this is a green banana and that's a brown banana, while they'll say ripe and unripe. So this might be one of the reasons why they don't have as many consistent color terms. There are 3 terms that the whole community tends to share, which are the terms for red, black, and white, haibas, hainas, and tsincas. But for the rest of them, everyone has different, not everyone, but there's a few terms that are shared that people use. So for instance, for yellow, we've encountered up to like 5 terms. Usually people will call it chames, some people will call it kuchiesi, some people will call it itsiesi. So there's more variability there. So our question was, given this massive difference between Tsimane and Spanish in the number of color terms that they have, what happens to Tsimane color terms when Tsimane speakers learn Spanish? So there's a lot of Tsimane who will move from the communities that they live in into neighboring, well, not a lot, but there's a few Tsimane speakers who will move from their communities into neighboring Bolivian towns where Spanish is spoken, and therefore learn Spanish there. And we couch our ideas within the communicative efficiency hypothesis, which we think shapes human language. And so our predictions would be that Tsimane Spanish bilinguals would change their color vocabulary based on the need to communicate more effectively about colors. What does that mean? That means if a Tsimane speaker is still living in the Bolivian Amazon, where they don't need to talk about colors, and they're talking to other Tsimane monolingual speakers, they might not at all change their Tsimane color system. Alternatively, they might borrow Spanish color terms when they learn Spanish, given that they're more consistent. Or a third possibility is that Tsimane speakers might alter their color system, restructuring their own color terms to make them more consistent. So because we tested people Tsimane speakers who were living in an industrialized setting, who were living in San Borja, the town, we think the 2 latter hypotheses might be more possible in our case. So how did we go about testing this? We tested 71 Tsimane monolingual speakers, 30 Spanish monolingual speakers, 30 Tsimane Spanish bilingual speakers. The latter 2 were tested within the San Borja town that I was referring to. And the Tsimane Spanish bilinguals were highly dominant in Tsimane, such that they spoke it natively. They said they spoke more Tsimane than Spanish. They rated themselves to be more proficient, and they had lived in Tsimane speaking communities for longer. And we run them on 3 tasks, and all these tasks make use of a Munsell color board, where hue is represented on the x-axis. So chips are arranged in a way that the hue is a way to I think of it as color, given that I'm not a vision scientist. So you'd have reds here, yellows, greens, then blues, purples, and reds. And the left side of the board and the right side of the board are really share similar hue properties. So it would really be a circle, but for our experimental purposes, we put it flat on a board. And then lightness is represented on the y-axis, with the very top having lighter colors, or more light, and the bottom having less light. And so we use what's a lighting box here in order to keep the consistent the colors. The visual properties change a lot based on the light. What you might be seeing right now on your screens might be very different from how I'm seeing it in my screen. And those are actually different from how I perceive them with the real Munsell board. So it's important to try and keep that constant and we try to do so with the lighting box. And the task we do first is a Munsell chip labeling task, where each of these chips are represented individually to and in a random order to a participant, and we ask them, what is the term that you would use to talk about this color, such that other members in your community will also understand what you're referring to. And we do this for all 80 chips in the Munsell board at a random order. And then we move on to the color selection time. So now that we know which terms that they're using, we take those terms and we ask, all right, they might have used, for instance, chamas. So we'll say, we give them the board and we say, can you please point to all the chips here that are chamas? And we do this for all the color terms. And last, we do a focus selection test where we just ask them, which is the best chip that represents the color term? So which is the best chamas on this board? And as you might see, it's a long task. People sometimes get bored, especially those waiting to do the task, but it's relatively easy for them to do. And sometimes we have like uninvited guests who are less interested in the task. I'm just sharing this picture to give the reality of like, field research, but the monolingual and bilingual speakers were tested within San Borja in our hotel room, so in more tightly controlled settings. And for half of the monolinguals, we were able to test indoors with less participants, although you can see that participants were not, people waiting around were not interested in what we were doing. So what do we find? For the first task where we have people naming color words, we calculate an average surprisal rate. And the average surprisal here is a little different from what we think of from the eye tracking and ERP and stuff. So what we calculate is we sum together a value for each word that they might have used to label a chip. Which is the probability that the word was used to refer the chip by the surprisal associated with the chip being referred to the word, which in other words is how consistently people are labeling the task and how surprised people are when they hear a term. And the way to give you an intuitive measure of what these average surprisal values mean, say for this chip, which I would call red, we can think of it as a communication game. If I said, I'm referring to the red chip, you might be, given that there's not a lot of red chips on this board, it might be very quick for you to figure out which chip I'm referring to. So red would have a lower surprisal value than if I was talking about this chip, where I might say it's turquoise. And it might, given that there's a larger space of greens and blues, it might be harder or take you more guesses to understand that that was the chip I was referring to more precisely. So that would have a higher surprisal value. We already know that in general, Spanish monolingual speakers have lower surprisal value than Tsimane monolingual speakers. And the question here really is, what happens with Tsimane when Tsimane speakers learn Spanish? And we see that their surprisal values are lower, such that they're using terms more consistently. And it's even lower for when they complete the task in Spanish. So the average surprisal value decreases in Tsimane speakers when they learn Spanish. So we can conclude that when Tsimane speakers learn Spanish, they use color terms more consistently than Tsimane monolinguals. But what are those terms that they're using? Are they using Tsimane terms? Are they using Spanish terms? Next, we're looking at the color selection task, and we're plotting here our modal majority terms. So here are highlighted chips that at least 50% of the participants use the same term consistently, and the size of the chip scales up with how many people were using that term. And Spanish monolingual, as we know, are highly consistent. There's these 11 terms, there's 12 terms, but white is not represented here. There's these 11 amarillo, anaranjado, celeste, rosado, verde, azul, morado, negro, chocolate, and rojo that are used very consistently by the speakers, which we already knew. And on the other hand, we know that Tsimane monolinguals are less consistent. So there's a few chips where people will use chamas for them, highness, efuyesi, chocolate, yes, and cinques. To know chocolate it's a term that the Tsimane borrowed many years ago to talk about chocolate. So yesi is like the suffix that they used to say color of. And as you can see, there's this massive space where there doesn't seem to be agreement between 50% of the people tested on what those terms are. But they use like two terms we hear a lot for green and blue, are changes and yushness, and they use them interchangeably, such that there seems to be like what we call a green-blue groove space. But none of the terms, neither of these terms are used by at least 50% of the population. Now, when Tsimane speakers learn Spanish, they seem to learn Spanish well. They pick up these 11 terms, you know, and they between them, they seem to be using these 11 terms relatively consistently. And we see that for Tsimane here, once they've learned Spanish, the bilinguals are, now we get like greens and blues spaces and a term used more consistently. The question being now, what is that term? Are they using Tsimane words or are they borrowing Spanish? What we see is that yushnish and shanjas get separated, and one gets allocated to shanjas and one gets allocated to yushnish. And so we conclude that the model terms by Tsimane Spanish bilinguals when doing the task in Tsimane are the same ones than those used by Tsimane monolingual. So in other words, they're restructuring Tsimane color terms. If we look at the distribution for each chip, you will see that Spanish monolingual speakers divide the Munsell board in very neat, consistent distribution set. Like, so blue, there's a few chips that refer to blue, some refer to green, et cetera, right? They're like the limitations are very constrained. For Tsimane monolinguals, they're very broad and very spread. And as you can see, blue and green, there is an overlap between which chips they pick for green or for yushnish, which chips they pick for shanjas. And there might be, say, for cafe or chocolate yesi, there is a concentration of chips that they pick that seem to be similar to those of Spanish monolinguals, but they tend to be a little more lax with like how many chips they would include for each of these terms. For Tsimane Spanish bilinguals, when doing the task in Spanish, they're very similar to Spanish monolinguals, and we perform chi-square tests to like figure out whether the differences between the distributions are significant. And lastly, notably, for Tsimane Spanish bilingual in Tsimane, we see that the number of chips that they're picking have become narrower from those of monolingual. So the color space for each color term seems to become narrower as the Tsimane speakers learn Spanish. So as we say here, color spaces for each color term becomes narrower. And you might have noticed, you know, the most prominent effect is in green and blue, where there's an overlap, while there's no overlap in the Spanish monolingual group. We can try and quantify this effect. So what we can plot is the distribution of the chips, such that, you know, we can plot here the distribution for blue and for green, given that they're neighboring color terms on the board. And so we see here that 40% of people use select chips that are in row 15 or in column 15, 30% pick chips that are in row 14, and so on and so forth. And then we can do the same for green, where it seems more spread. So sorry, I would say from column 5 to column 13, it's contains 100% of the chips that are picked by people. All right, and so we can plot the same for each of the groups. As we see here, Tsimane monolinguals, there's an overlap between the two. There's the two distributions are more differentiated in Spanish for Tsimane Spanish bilinguals, and they seem to be more differentiated as well. And we'll see now that indeed they are for Tsimane and Tsimane Spanish bilinguals. And these can be plotted for more color terms. I'm showing 3 here, but within the board, there's at least 12 different like neighboring colors. So you can plot yellow and green, reds, blues and purples, and so on and so forth. So we plotted this for every neighboring color terms, and we measured the KL divergence to understand what the difference is between these two probabilities. So how far apart are these distributions? Is there an overlap or not? And so we see that for Spanish monolinguals, the KL divergent value is very high because the distributions of neighboring color terms are more separate. And for Tsimane monolinguals, they're very low because these distributions tend to have a lot of overlap. For Tsimane Spanish bilinguals completing the task in Spanish, the distributions are also high and not statistically different from Spanish monolinguals. While for Tsimane Spanish bilinguals completing the task in Tsimane, these distributions are higher than those of Tsimane monolinguals. So we conclude here that the neighboring color terms are more easily differentiated by Tsimane speakers upon learning Spanish. So when Tsimane speakers learn Spanish, they differentiate better between color terms with similar hue values. In other words, neighboring color terms. In conclusion, Tsimane speakers seem to restructure the color terms upon learning Spanish. They use Tsimane terms more consistently. The color spaces for each color terms become narrower, and the color spaces become more differentiated between neighboring color terms. These results are consistent with different approaches. So these results are in line with the Whorfian hypothesis, where they postulate that learning a new language can alter concepts in a native language. But at the same time, they're consistent with the communicative efficiency hypothesis, with increased communicative efficiency occurring due to industrialization. In other words, because they need to talk about colors more now that they're an industrialized town, they restructure their color terms. And to a prediction that would differentiate these two theories would be, or not theories, but these two hypotheses is that Tsimane speakers who learn Spanish but would remain in the Amazon would not be showing these effects because they don't need to talk about color. So in other words, if you don't live in an industrialized society, in an industrialized region, you might still continue to use color terms less consistently because you don't really need to talk about color. We don't have the data for this, and we look forward to be able to collect it once we are able to go back to Bolivia, hopefully soon. And these results have implications for studies using bilingual populations. More notably, Berlin and Kay in 1969, they observed there was a universal pattern in how colors enter a language's lexicon, and they used data from bilingual speakers. These were bilingual speakers from many different native languages who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. Berlin and Kay are incredible anthropologists at Berkeley. However, everyone that they tested in that study also spoke English. So there might have been effects from English onto Spanish, onto like the native language that they would be testing. There were some participants that they had who were from Mexico, but they happened to also be bilingual speakers of Spanish. And these universal pattern they observed was not observed later when they went on and collected data from monolingual speakers in the word color survey. And we think the difference here was the fact that the speakers were bilingual in the first case. And so it's a cautionary tale to making interpretations when using data from bilingual speakers. And taking together, we would like to conclude and leave you with this message: that learning a second language can restructure concepts in a native language. And with that, I would like to thank Ted, Bevil, and Kyle for their incredible help during this project. I had the good luck to work with 3 different professors with 3 different approaches, and I learned a lot from them. And thank you for listening attentively to this talk.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. We have about 7 minutes for questions. And there are some people moving towards the microphone as we speak. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you very much for the talk. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering, unless I misunderstood the data, there were the 2 terms that are interchangeable, that are used interchangeably for green and blue in Tsimane, the sort of yes, and the other one. And they really did look, to be interchangeable in the language. But then when they become bilingual, it seemed like one was consistently being mapped onto green, and the other one was consistently being mapped onto blue, which is surprising to me, because you might expect that people might, may vary in which one they map onto which color if they really are interchangeable. So I was wondering if there's anything, if you have any kind of ideas why that might be the case, if there's anything about the usage of these two terms that might push one towards green and one towards blue that might explain this data.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there needs to be a consistency at some point if we are using like the color terms to communicate. So it could have gone, to some extent, it could have gone either way, but at some point the community or the speakers need to come to an understanding that this is the term for blue and this is the term for green if it's going to have any use, because otherwise if they're still using it interchangeably, it wouldn't be useful at all, right? But the reason why they might be picking shanges for green is because I believe leafy terms have, they use a similar term. It's not shanges, but has a similar sound to shanges. And so perhaps potentially that might be the reason why shanges ends up getting attributed to green. And I'm not sure like where the etymology of yushin is or how it relates to other words, but probably that's one of the reasons why shanges ends up getting used for green.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a comment on the conclusion that you're making about restructuring the concept. So I was thinking of the difference between bilinguals and monolinguals, and the lack of consistency of some colors in labeling some colors in the monolingual group it could be because these people do not have a labeling system for those colors, so they just they use some random, not completely random, but they use them in a more random way to label those colors. But in bilingual groups, they have another system, to label those colors. So and they are using the labeling system in Spanish, and there is kind of consistency because they are mapping another system to to label those colors. But in the monolingual group, they don't have any other system, so there is no consensus among the community how to label those colors, and that's why you don't see any consistency in labeling those colors, right? It doesn't need to be labeling colors doesn't need to be in a consistent way to show a restructuring of the concepts.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. My thought there would be if they were using just like the Spanish system and mapping that onto Tsimane, celeste, which is light blue in Bolivian, would also probably appear in the Tsimane Spanish bilinguals in Tsimane as well. So I'm not sure if it's really, given that it doesn't show up, I'm not sure that they are just mapping on the Spanish system onto the Tsimane one. But rather there's some other kind of restructuring going on that that occurs when they learn Spanish. Maybe they just feel that they realize like, there's a need for you, or there is the use for having more consistent color terms. And so they restructure their own Tsimane color terms to be more consistent for that communicative purpose. But if they were just mapping on from Spanish, I would expect celeste or like a term to appear that would be for light blue in Tsimane as well.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
So do you think that the monolingual group who don't show a consistency with some colors, do you think that they cannot recognize the difference between those colors?
No, there's a lot of perceptual tasks that have been done. They definitely can see colors, they recognize differences. They just don't need to talk about them. I know it's like, to me, it was a little mind-blowing when I first found out, but again, like given their environment, they don't need to talk much about color. They can use other terms, they can use textures, they can use properties of objects to talk about those terms, like how mature they are, or like there's the state of things, right? Like such as they would never say the blue sky, and really we could be saying the cloudless sky. So I just think the monolingual speakers just don't need to talk about color, but they're more certainly can see them and can see the differences.
Yeah, and I'm not very familiar with these studies on color terms, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think there is also another task where people should match colors, right? Color matching task. I think I was wondering if you have done or are you going to do such a?
Yeah, I think those tasks that you're talking about, they require reaction time, right? If we're thinking about the same task. And the issue with doing reaction time is already we're asking them to do something highly unnatural. And I had another task where I had them naming pictures and color words, and I had a poster on that yesterday. But sometimes, like when you ask them to be fast and do it as fast as possible, like that instruction doesn't really translate well. Like they don't have any sense to why there's this urgency to like do this matching that we're asking them to do. So it's really tricky to those color matching patterns where like the dependent variable is reaction time, because I think there's you can't really measure reaction time that well especially with the monolinguals. With the bilinguals, I've done a picture naming task, and they understand the instructions a little better. Maybe we'll figure out a way to get them to respond faster, but yeah, so far it's tricky to convey the need to do the task quickly so that we can get the effects that we see.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank our speaker. Okay, and it is now time for the very last talk, and I believe there are announcements, closing remarks afterwards, right? So stick around after the last talk for closing remarks.